Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Allison Flepson. I'm the Reading Program Specialist with the Reading and Reach initiative, which is implemented by URC. We're based here in Bethesda, in the Bethesda area outside of Washington, D.C. We're very happy that you could join us today for the last webinar in our November Early Grade Reading webinar series. Today we have Amy Palangio who's joining us, along with myself, to talk about from conception to scale, how we go about program design, thinking to expansion, and the sustainability of our programs. So a little bit of information about the Professional Development Series, if you're just joining us for the first time today. This was developed by Reading Within Reach, which is funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development. Reach supports the Global Reading Network, which is what we're more well known for, a community of practice that develops and shares research, innovations, and resources related to early grade reading. If you're not already familiar with the resources that we have available, you can check them out on our website at theglobalreadingnetwork.net. A couple new resources have recently been uploaded there, as well as all of the presentation materials and handouts from the previous webinars are there as well. And this webinar was presented by a number of people, as you see in this blue box here. Supporting this effort, though, was the input from many, many people within the Global Reading Network who looked at draft materials, who shared resources and program experiences to really enrich it and to make it be really a resource on what programs now are doing and what they think is important for us to all be thinking about. So the goal of this webinar series was to provide all of the people implementing early grade reading programs with a real good snapshot of all the evidence that we have to date on what is effective in terms of supporting teachers and helping students to read better, to share guidance that programs have learned in the past several years now since programs have been implemented, and also to share resources to support the design and the ongoing implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. We know there's a lot out there, but it's often spread out, or we don't necessarily know what is a good resource to use or adapt. And so we really tried hard to bring all of that together in these webinars and the training modules and put that in one place for people. So each of the sessions has been focused on a key technical topic, as well as included references to cross-cutting issues. So you will see references on how we need to be developing approaches that address gender issues, how we integrate technology, how we think about making our reading programs inclusive in to all learners of different abilities. So these are not standalone sessions, but you will find resources on them that we reference throughout. Last but not least, we've tried to talk about monitoring, evaluation, scales, and sustainability throughout them. We'll be touching on that more today as we really think about programs that are already in the phase of needing to scale up or have scaled up, and what have they learned and what can others take away from their lessons. Last but not least, the approach of this webinar series has been to facilitate discussion and interaction. Well, there's of course a barrier since we're all in different places. We've integrated throughout opportunities for conversation, where we'll pause and we will discuss with you what you are experiencing, the questions you have. Throughout the presentation, though, feel free to engage in those conversations with others who are on the webinar. So here are the first 5 webinars. As I mentioned, all the materials are now available on the Global Reading Network website under the Tools and Training tab. Not the News and Events tab there. That was to register for future webinars. But since this is our last one, you can find it shortly after. All the materials will be available, and we are also working on recordings of the webinars. So if you missed one, but you'd actually like to watch it and listen, you will have the ability to do that soon. I also wanted to mention, if you're inclined to social media, we do post on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn in particular, information and when resources are available. So you're welcome to follow us there. So we're diving in today to talk about from conception to scale, program design, expansion, and sustainability. As I mentioned, my colleague Amy Palangio is joining us today. Has more than 25 years of experience working in education, program development, and international program implementation with a focus on literacy, government capacity building, and cross-cutting social development models. She is permanently based in Tanzania, where she is today as well, and she works as an independent educational consultant. Amy first joined the GRN as a technical consultant in 2016 and has continued to support us in various ways through training, professional development, and resource development since then. She's also served in similar roles for Creative Associates, the International Literacy Association, the Global Center for Learning and Innovation, and World Learning. And she has conducted early grade reading program work in Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, Nepal, and the Philippines. She was previously the vice president of a US-based educational professional development organization, the Collaborative for Teaching and Learning, and a literacy assessment specialist with Measured Progress. She has a Master's of Education as a clinical reading specialist from the University of Louisville and a Bachelor of Education as well in K through 10 education. So Amy is going to start us off today. Amy, welcome.
Okay, I want to also introduce Allison today as my co-presenter. Allison Flepson is the REACH Reading Program Specialist. She supports the design and development of resources and professional development opportunities for the Global Reading Network. Allison has 15 years of experience designing and managing education-related programs in sub-Saharan Africa. And prior to joining REACH, she worked for 6 years at RTI International, where she helped design and implement early grade literacy programs, assessments, training manuals, and resources. And one area of particular interest and expertise with Allison is language use in education, particularly as it relates to reading and language learning. So thank you, Allison, for doing the introduction today. And as Allison said, it's my role to get us started with session 6 today, the last session of the series, Planning, Scale Up, and Sustainability. We're going to be focusing in 3 sections of work today on the webinar series. First of all, looking at the kind of progress that's been made in early grades reading program around the world and the gaps that still exist within early grades programming. And that's gaps in the data. It's also the data that shows us that there are gaps in some of the program components as well. And we'll be kind of taking the pulse of participants today on where you think it is in terms of your own program work, where things are going well, you're seeing lots of progress, and there might still be some gaps in your program. Looking at progress and gaps overall in the broader EGR community is important as we start to look toward continued program development, program revision also, and as well as how to create programs that can scale up efficiently and effectively and that can be sustainable after the life of external funding is done. We're also going to be taking a look at what kinds of knowledge and skills are really important in terms of being effective in implementation, leading and managing large-scale early grade reading programs, and then some steps you can take to make sure your program is of the best quality that it can be, how to inform your programs as well using data and additional kind of background research and contextual information, and then focusing particularly on what do we know about scale-up efforts and what are the characteristics of projects that we know are effective in scaling up the work. So throughout the session, we will be asking you to ask any questions that you have and to use the Q&A box to submit your questions. There will also be times when we engage you in some chats here and there. So section 1, as I said, is focused on progress and gaps in early grades reading programs. So we first want to take a look at what we've accomplished so far. So take just a moment to take a look at the data and the graphic that are on the screen. So as you can see, All Children Reading Program has reached a lot of children in the last 6 years, 69.8 million children who are reached. But if you look down to the next bar on the screen, outcomes were measured for only 28 million of those children. And then sliding down to the next bar on the screen, we're showing 4 million children with improved reading performance, and that is statistically significant improved reading performance. So we have a number of children who are appearing to show no reading improvement, but there are some issues that surround these data that tell us that they're not actually telling us everything about the success of programs. First of all, many of the projects to date still only have baselines. We also know that even though we may not be seeing larger numbers of students with improved reading, what we are seeing is that zero scores diminish pretty well within these programs. And that's usually, of course, the first impact that you can see is that children are actually able to access the reading assessment components in order to be able to respond in some ways, which is a first step to moving children forward toward fluent reading. A number of things behind the delay on the data and the lack of data that shows impact at this point is that when this approach for all children reading got started, it was really in kind of a mid-course change from what was initially kind of a technology focus into a literacy focus, and trying to ramp up those programs, of course, internationally is difficult to do. One of the other things that we've seen is that there was really at the local level insufficient technical expertise and insufficient number of people who had the kind of technical expertise that was necessary to support local knowledge and skills development and to continue to support programs over time, because the demand for the expertise with the scale of the work was so massive. Now, of course, one of the great things that's been happening in programs around the world is the development of country-specific expert teams and reading teams. And so as we move into the second phase of this work, we're seeing a lot more capacity on the ground. We're also seeing a lot more attention to the structured large-scale data collection and looking very deeply at subcomponents, the relationships between reading subdomains and subcomponents and how those link together. Another issue that impacted the ability to gather the kind of data that we need and know what it tells us is an insufficient attention to policy and factors of context in specific countries. So those factors really can kind of overwhelm what you're trying to do in terms of data collection and finding out whether programs are working or not. So this is the current status of what we've accomplished so far. And we're going to be taking a look next at some of the gaps that we do know exist. So if you take a look, first of all, at the skills gaps. So one of the things that we know is across the subdomains, if you're looking at subdomains of AGRA data, that reading skills gains have not only been small in terms of their magnitude, but also in terms of effect sizes. So while we're seeing gains in just about every area, those gains have not gained momentum at this point, at least in terms of the current data sets that are coming in and available from multiple countries. Another issue is that it's been very difficult to show progress in comprehension because it's difficult to measure. It's much more difficult to measure. It's more extensive in terms of time. It's also more difficult in terms of analysis and to get a reliable set of data. Another additional difficulty that I'm not sure was anticipated, but looking back, we can see that it makes sense, is that it's very hard to show gains in countries that are at either end of the spectrum. So countries with very low starting points are still battling those zero scores and basic knowledge and skills of teachers and basic practices in classrooms. Countries with high starting points, as we know in terms of looking at most assessment results, it becomes the higher you're performing, the more difficult it becomes to show improvement. Boys generally overall outperformed girls, but girls are throughout the data sets closing the gap pretty quickly on boys. One of the things we love to see is that when instruction is provided in local languages, in mother tongue, it produced higher reading scores for children. We do have some difficulty being able to dig down into the data for specific groups, for specific regions within a country, because a lot of the evaluations didn't report any disaggregated findings. So that's the information on skills. And if you take a look at instruction, on instruction, we do see that the longer that students are focused on reading instruction and working with reading, that is linked to a positive impact on learning. This is a struggle in developing context because in many cases, it's one of the most difficult things is to address those kinds of policy and time issues. It's linked in many ways to misunderstandings between literacy instruction and language instruction or grammar instruction, and to be able to gain the time in public schools in some countries to get sufficient time for reading instruction is quite difficult to do. In terms of instruction as well, another issue to be able to that we need to look at and we need to get more data on is how fidelitas is instruction. And one of the things that was found overall through direct observation of teachers and even self-reporting is that fidelity inside programs is pretty low, which for me is very interesting because many of our programs really focused on providing scripted lesson plans, providing very high structure for what should be happening in the classroom and when, very clearly laid out curriculum. So one of the things we may need to look at in terms of a gap is monitoring and accountability gap, because we know the basic best practices to approach reading instruction that will help children read. And what we have to be able to do is give teachers sufficient time and incentive to implement those practices, to see the proof in their classroom that they work in order to be able to have that sustained change in the classroom. So in terms of materials, what the data do show is that the interventions that have taken place are pretty successful at producing and delivering textbooks for reading, and those textbooks tend to include the correct kinds of elements. But sometimes there are pretty massive delays in that. We did a webinar earlier in this series on resource development. And one of the critical things we talked about is back mapping a materials development process and not underestimating how long it can take to produce quality materials, field test those, and then get them through the supply chain into schools. Another issue that we run into in terms of knowing about the impact of materials is that many evaluations were not designed to look specifically at things like teachers' guides and whether teachers' guides had an effect on what happened in the classroom or what happened for students. However, we do see some evidence that having a teacher's guide can mitigate some of the challenges that result from cascade training. And for those who may be saying, what exactly do you mean by cascade training? That is a multi-tiered training model where in many cases it's quite necessary because of the numbers of teachers that need to be trained. But we also know that every time you step down in a cascade training model, we lose some fidelity in training, and we also lose some information. So that by the time it gets to teachers, they have to really rely on the teacher's guide to know exactly what to do. And of course, because of some delays in production, delays in delivery, use of those materials in classrooms were sometimes limited. So on teacher professional development, okay, thank you. On teacher professional development, what we know is that the activities in teacher professional development that provided 2 or 3 different components of professional development access could have a better chance of success than those that focused on one intervention. So, for example, if teacher professional development had different pieces of training that were put together in different ways, then we know that teachers may be implemented on a more fidelitous basis and more often, and that could have an impact on student learning. But there is very little evidence of a quantitative relationship between training that teachers get and the kind of outcomes that happen for children in the classroom. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's a lot of, for all of us who work in the field and see teacher training, see response to teacher training, and then see what happens in classrooms, we can feel and believe that there is a relationship, but there's very little evidence of that. We also don't have enough information on the impact of duration on the impact of specific materials, or even on follow-up. So this kind of pulls us down into the coaching gaps as well. So even though we know coaching shows promise, we don't have a measure of how training links to coaching and how coaching links to teaching and how teaching links to student outcomes. So there's a lot of different parallel lines of data collection that need to be gathered, and they also need to be linked together as well. And also in coaching, there's a lot of implementation difficulties. Some of them due to limited staffing or staffing with staff that are maybe not the correct staff. Also, the ability to provide sufficient training to coaches and follow-up support, coaching of coaches, which we talked about in our coaching webinar. And then the logistical issues of location, getting coaches to schools, being able to track what happens in the schools, being able to share those data up into programs, and being able to know just what's going on. Okay, so if you look at these pieces, community engagement, there was a lot of focus and emphasis on getting the community engaged actively, but we don't have a lot of data on what type of community engagement works or how much it might impact student learning. In addition, with cross-cutting issues, the interventions that included learners with disabilities or different kinds of financing or technology, these were small, and then evidence on these kinds of interventions really was not, the data was not gathered. But we do know that interventions related to gender were among the most successful. One of the critical things for sustainability and scale up, which is what we're talking about today, is making sure that the players left behind at the end of an external program are prepared for picking up the baton and moving the program forward. And so one of the things we know is that support for ministry to support monitoring and evaluation was generally unsuccessful. Also, those interventions that used data to impact policy and to shift policy, there was limited success with making this happen. Capacity building and scale up, which is our conversation today, showed even at the end of multi-year programs, little evidence of the government's ability to take over the reading interventions. And so that really is one of the core purposes for our work today, is to start taking a look at when and how do you begin to prepare for scale up and sustainability in the hands of local leadership inside countries after external programs are over. So I want you to think about your own program, okay, and think about what are some of the progress and gaps that you see in your own program. Are they the same as the ones we just talked about, or are you seeing things differently? Do you sometimes see that places where we see gaps and issues, you have had successes? If you are using some unique approaches that you think are resulting in better student outcomes and a better data set to support that. So if you think about your own program in terms of, for example, coaching or teacher professional development or materials provision, are you seeing similar problems and gaps? Are you seeing things that are different? So we have a note from Federico, who talks about the significant improvement in the ability to source books and materials. And I think that is interesting because we do know that there's a lot more materials being made available, and there's also a lot more materials being developed locally, which is critical in terms of making sure the resources and materials available for children are within the context, within language context and within local cultural context for students as well. And that's been a major kind of parallel effort that's been going on over the last 6 or 7 years to make sure that local teams of writers and local programs are prepared to develop more materials, that those kinds of development processes and projects continue to have a life of their own. They're low cost and they're fairly easy to implement and to control in terms of quality. So I think we're going to continue to see lots and lots more materials available and a lot less need to kind of start from scratch, but instead to draw on what's there. Of course, that requires us to do the background research when we come into a new setting to support people in making positive change, that we know what already exists, that we know the quality of what already exists, and that we know how to supplement that with specific things. Federico also is talking here about coaching, second and third coaching sessions. Yeah, coaching is a lot about building relationships and trust with teachers. And in fact, I would say that it's probably 50% about that, being able to have open conversation about practice. And as long as your coaches are well prepared to take that mentorship role and also knowledgeable in terms of the classroom program, taking time to build relationships with teachers and create that area of trust really can make coaching be much more, have much more of an impact. We've had discussion here about reading tools, monitoring tools as well. Okay, and Matt has a follow-up question. Little data on programs for students with disabilities in IT, and wants to know, is that due to a low number of programs sampled or a lack of data within those programs? Matt, it's due to a lack of data within those programs, and in many cases, in many countries, it's due to a very small N of students, a very small number of students within the regular classroom who are also then identified, who then are assessed, and that assessment data disaggregated. So we're actually not sampling data, we're looking at program data that's been provided from all USAID programs into USAID. And so it really trickles down to, at the country-specific program level, that the evaluation plans have not planned to gather those kind of data. And that's, of course, one of the gaps that needs to be addressed. So we've got a few other comments. Okay, I think let's see, we have Christine, Christina, who talks about the issue of time, and time for quality development of resources and time for field testing prior to implementation. And that's always an issue, Christina, when you're moving into a new program phase and you're trying to prep and do your background research, create your materials, and under pressure to get people trained as well. I think this is something that we all have experienced in our work. And I know that everyone involved wants to have quality training. They want to have quality resources at the same time that we're always all working on the fast track as well. Patricia from SAVE says that the gaps are really resonating with her. And I want to refer you to her comment here. Lack of careful attention to cost is an issue. Fluency and comprehension, it's significant. So I would agree with you. Need to look at fidelity of implementation. It is an issue. And I think, I want to say, Patricia, the discussion of fidelity of implementation linked to highly structured and linked to scripted lesson plans. There's a lot of conversation going on about that now. And I think we want to continue to ask the question, what do we mean by fidelity of implementation? And I think probably within different programs, we have different definitions of what we mean by fidelity. And the more structured and scripted a program is, probably the less fidelity we will see. But I think there's a lot of room for conversation about how do you implement a program with fidelity, make sure teachers are using the program with fidelity so that you can actually know from the data whether it's working, you can draw conclusions. But we also, at the same time, when we talk about sustainability at the classroom level, we want to make sure that teachers are able to make the kinds of decisions they need to make, for example, in response to continuous assessment. And so that, for some people, pushes on the issue of fidelity. So I think an ongoing conversation about the balance between fidelity and flexibility, the balance between common approaches and the need for on-the-spot teachable moment teacher decision-making is something that needs to continue to be discussed at the core of every program and in the larger community as well. So lots of good conversations. So we've seen some successes and we've seen some gaps. And in response to those successes and gaps, the U.S. government has released a new strategy. This was just released in September of 2018. And one of the great things we see here is this, this note of particularly marginalized and vulnerable populations. And so this really addresses the issue of inclusion. It also addresses the issue of asking the questions about how do we make sure all means all? How do we make sure we can identify kids who need additional support? How do we move schools, teachers, and education systems to the place where they can provide that support? So continuing on with good quality basic education programs, but those that are specifically now focusing on how do we get the outreach in there so that all children have an opportunity to learn. And also this whole issue of sustainability and scale up as well. In addition to the USG strategy, USAID has just released, and I mean really just released in the last 2 weeks, their new policy. And so if you haven't seen it, take the time to look at it here for just a minute. I do want you to read that, please. So if you look at the policy, again, we have an emphasis on marginalized and vulnerable children. And looking at issues of safety and relevance. This is this issue of one program does not fit all contexts, and the inclusion of social well-being. So it's really looking at the whole child, not just the development of skills. And we have a specific focus now on literacy, numeracy, and social emotional skills. So we're all really glad to see that, particularly in the early grades range. As we look at early grades, and we know that those basic foundational skills in literacy and numeracy and a positive self-image and feeling of self-efficacy and readiness to learn are really critical at the young stages. And then also we're looking at youth employment and youth skills for future employment and the inclusion of higher education institutions. This is new, and it's great to see that, and I think what we're looking at here is not only higher education institutions on the back end of student education, not just from primary to secondary to higher ed, but also engaging teacher training institutions as well, and linking in pre-service training. So beginning to look at programs that not only do outreach in terms of in-service training for teachers and pre-primary literacy, numeracy, and social emotional skill, but also linking in pre-service systems. Those of us who work in a developing context know that in the regular business of education systems in developing contexts, pre-service training institutions are highly involved at the upper levels and in the regional levels with government to provide in-service training. And so to officially kind of say we need to go at it from both ends in a systematic way is really a great thing. To begin section 2, which is taking a look at the essential components and steps for developing an early grades program. And on the screen, you will see what's called the Mosaic. And the Mosaic is kind of a framework that's a framework that's being talked about and used a lot right now in new development of USAID thinking and USAID programs. Of course, it is not an official framework that all programs have to use, but it is one that is guiding a lot of work that's going on now, a comprehensive design and implementation approach. So as you look at the Mosaic, you may say to yourself, well, of course, these are all the kinds of things that need to support moving children to the place where they have achieved reading goals by the end of early primary. But if we think about a lot of our programs and our program history, some programs focus on particular elements at a higher level and some programs do not. And so one of the things we like seeing with the Mosaic is that we're being asked to think about our program design and our program implementation to make sure that we intentionally address all of these pieces. And from a reading program point of view, a reading person point of view, I really love to see the effective teacher coaching and mentoring. We know in early EGR program implementation, coaching and mentoring was taking place in a lot of programs, but it was kind of as a follow-up and a backup to the primary focus on materials provision and teacher training. And so as a core pillar really here in this framework, what we know is some of those gaps in coaching and some of those gaps in coaching information we're going to be filling in the coming years and learning a lot more about all of these things. The Mosaic is really a critical kind of framework to think about when you review your own existing programs, and also as you move forward to design new programs, making sure that you have substantive and quality approaches in each of these areas, because as we know, they're all very critical for making sure that children are able to read and that programs can be scaled up and sustained over time. So in moving into the next section, we're looking at the characteristics of programs that are effective. And these programs are not just providing these core elements, as you can see in the colored ovals on the left, within your program team, but really working in collaboration, which you see as the second one, with all of the stakeholders that are essential. So in terms of leadership, we really need to be able to develop not only our team's leadership, but we need to really influence the stakeholders in the environment who can support early grades reading improvement. We need to design an evidence-based system that's contextually appropriate, meaning it's designed for that particular area, and then work with leaders in the local area to manage programs and activities. And to also build those partnerships. So if you think about beginning a program with integrating leadership from the program, with leadership from the ministry, with leadership at the regional and local level, you really can have an influence on sustainability of programs after external processes are finished. Facilitating collaboration among stakeholders, getting different groups that have a stake in student learning to begin working together and talking together, using really clearly established processes, tools, and also norms for how people will collaborate together. Because in many cases, you're coming into a setting where groups that you might assume are working together and talking together are not. And bringing those groups in as partners to help them to really build their own effective approaches as well. Also, building consensus around a program and negotiating the differences that people might bring in terms of what they think is a priority. Because one of the critical things for sustaining programs is to make sure that there's ownership over the process and that there's a belief that using evidence-based approaches are the things that you're doing, are the activities and approach to improve reading instruction and skills, do they reflect current knowledge about the most effective ways to teach children to read? And have you put that kind of evidence in context for people? One of the barriers we know in terms of program solidity and scale up and sustainability is helping those local stakeholders and local leaders take ownership over and believe in that program and carry it forward. And so we need to help people understand that there is clear evidence that approaches certain kinds of approaches, that supports certain kinds of approaches, and that we can bring those approaches into the context within which their children are learning to read, and contextualize those approaches, still focused on research-based best practices and in the context, so that there is belief in the sustainability and the efficacy of the program. And then looking at quality assurance, making sure we have qualified technical expertise on programs. That's within an externally funded program, that's within the ministry as well. So we need to develop approaches and activities that are evidence-based, they're appropriate for the context, they're inclusive, and they're designed with scale up and sustainability in mind from the very beginning. If we begin to start up in year one, we implement in year two, we reflect and refine in year three. If we begin to take a look at scale up and sustainability in year four, it's far too late. This has to be a part of that initial planning. And if you think back to the mosaic on the previous screen, again, those core 6 pillars, if you address those from the beginning, you will always be able to have a better chance of having a sustainable program in the hands of local stakeholders when external support may be ended.
So thinking about some of those key steps related to program planning. Now, many of you, if not all of you, have experience implementing programs, designing programs. So some of this may seem probably relatively basic, but we've wanted to sort of sketch out all of the different phases of program design and implementation as we sort of step back at this particular moment in time with the new USAID education strategy, and as programs are moving into their second generation, how can we improve and enhance the design of our programs that are ongoing, that are going to be continuing, especially now that we have a lot of information about what's working and what's not. Let's think again back to kind of square one about how we go about planning and designing both for new programs and for second generation or even third generation programs. So the first step that many of us know is so essential is the involvement of a diverse range of stakeholders in the planning and design. But this is something I think in the rush of program development, starting at the level of often donors who are the ones who put together the frameworks for the programs that many of us implement, is that they aren't always as collaboratively planned as would be ideal in terms of soliciting opinions and gaining all the information that we need to form our programs. And that's where we often run into problems when not all those voices are at the table during the design phase. So some of those key voices that we need to have are, of course, our education authorities, our government collaborators in the countries that we work in, representatives from various branches of the government. So you have Ministry of Education, but you also have, of course, people in teacher training institutions, in Ministry of Finance, who need to be involved in planning and obtain consensus with them about the need for the program, what its focus is going to be, specific activities. We've all probably been in a situation where different folks thought a program might be doing something that it wasn't. And so everyone around the table needs to understand what are the parameters for the program and what are its ultimate objectives. That, of course, lays the groundwork for programs to hopefully be scaled up and to be sustained. As Amy already mentioned, technical experts, including reading specialists and linguists, are essential. They will help to identify the appropriate approach for improving reading outcomes that may be specific to your language, to help draft the curriculum and materials, be able to advise on appropriate ways of assessing children's reading and language skills in different languages, and teacher professional development experts who will help to map out the most contextually appropriate and effective way of training teachers and supporting them through coaching. As we've seen as well in some programs, sometimes those experts are not brought in until later on in a program, and then realizations are had about maybe there is a better scope and sequence of how we're introducing our skills or the specific components of the language. And so even at the design phase, that expertise is really essential to have. The involvement of teachers and teacher educators is also critical at that design phase. Teachers themselves can tell you what their constraints are and what do they need in terms of professional development, what approach might be most realistic for them in terms of workshops, coaching, community learning circles in their area. So understanding their needs, their challenges, as well as their attitudes and beliefs around reading and instruction will help to inform the different design aspects of the program. Experts in monitoring, evaluation, and research. We tend to think of that as a separate component of programs in its own sort of silo, but because of the design of a program needs to take monitoring and evaluation into consideration, all those people need to be around the planning table, be it real or virtual, at the same time. For example, a staggered approach to implementation may be needed if you want to appropriately assess your impact. You may need to think about how you're going to test different forms of teacher professional development, and that has implications for how you design your program. That monitoring and evaluation staff's involvement can also help them to be aware of the program components and how to best monitor and evaluate them. So rather than the program monitoring and evaluation staff just perhaps seeing their role as data collection, to really understand what is happening and to also collaborate on figuring out the best way of gathering information and most feasible as well. And of course, program managers and other staff who are responsible for the day-to-day implementation of a program, who are familiar with the context. They'll be able to ground truth a lot of ideas before they even are implemented, suggest activities, feasible approaches. I think we need to think of planning and design in multiple stages and how we refine it along the way and involve people from all different technical areas and different arms of a program to get the best design that's possible and most likely to be successful. The second is conducting what we're calling a literacy landscape assessment, which is essentially background research to understand the context and needs and to identify approaches and activities most likely to be effective in achieving outcomes. A lot of programs have noted that they have found a need for significant background research to inform their design, from understanding what are children's current literacy skills to understanding what teachers' skills are and whether teachers are speaking the language in the schools where they're assigned. This background research can take time to conduct, but it's tremendously useful. For example, some recent language mapping work in Ghana and Mozambique recently helped to identify what languages should be used for reading instruction, where multilingual classrooms exist, and thus where specific strategies might be needed to support children of different languages, and schools where teachers and students don't speak the same language, and therefore there's maybe policy or teacher placement issues that need to be addressed. So all of this data can help to ground decisions about policy and practice, and even programs that are in progress can continue to do it to refine their program design. A list of the research ideas to conduct can be found in handout 1, which we'll be discussing in just a minute. REACH is currently collaborating with USAID right now to develop a literacy landscape assessment toolkit, and the purpose of that is to help both donors and implementing partners go through different aspects of early grade reading programs and think about what information and research they need to really inform an effective program design. So we have been reaching out to many people in the Global Reading Network community on that, and we look forward to that resource being available soon. In the meantime, if you want to look at handout 1, and you should be able to access that from the Google folder if you haven't already. We'll bring it up on the screen here just so you know which one to be looking at. So this is just a summary of what we've heard programs have done or are doing in terms of information gathering. So as you're skimming that, if you want to just take note of which of these activities did you do to inform your program design, and how was this information gathering useful to you? And what are some of the things that you maybe didn't do that you could consider if that would be useful to your program at this time? So I know this was quite a lengthy list here, and you may not have time to read through everything. But if you take a look at the bolded main categories of information, you'll see this really covers a number of topics, from student assessment data, understanding what children's literacy skill levels are, and how those skills may need improvement through improved teacher professional development, and what kind of materials that children would need to help them improve on those skills. Which of these activities do you find particularly useful in doing to inform your program design? For example, somebody I saw in the chat talked about teacher retention issues being a big difficulty. In terms of data on that, were you able to collect it, and has that been useful in informing your design and figuring out who's getting the training and who might need to be retrained or trained again in a different year?
And Allison, this is Amy. I think also asking folks to think about the third question in particular. As you're working and as you're implementing, what are the kinds of questions you don't have the answers to, and you think you need them? So what research do you find yourself needing to do when you're actually inside implementation in order to better inform some of the choices and decisions you're needing to make as you see the impact of your program or problems that arise?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. We've heard from many people that a lot of the research they're undertaking is sort of post-program design, post-program startup, as those information needs have become really apparent. And for those who haven't necessarily implemented their programs, or we're still in the design phase or thinking about scale up, I think it is useful to think about what requests for proposals need to be including that they might not have. What information do you feel is really essential that we all have before we embark on our program? Federico noted a weakness in that there hadn't been enough consideration of the context, and certainly that could involve a number of aspects, what's happening in the education sector generally, issues with teacher professional development, what languages are being spoken and where, what are teachers' specific needs. It's great to hear, Federico, that you're flexible and you're able to adapt your program along the way.
Well, and Allison, this is linked to an earlier comment about the need for time at the front end of programs to conduct sufficient research on the context within which you're working, understand government policy and previous program approaches very thoroughly, know what kind of materials you have. And then we've got Federico also talking now about knowing what's actually going on in teachers' classrooms and why it wasn't working before we provide large-scale training and support.
Yes, and that's one of the suggested areas of research to conduct is those classroom observations, find out what is happening in the classroom, what instructional strategies are teachers using that you can build on so that when you design your reading programs, you're able to build on teacher strengths and the routines that they might already be using so that not everything is new to them, but you're taking what they do to apply it to more effective reading instruction. So I'm going to move on to talking about another aspect of information gathering and research, and that is learning more about the education system and its capacity. Programs, as we know, need to gain a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities that various institutions play and specific individuals within those different education units or divisions. This includes those responsible for curriculum development, student assessment, development of teaching and learning materials, the procurement of those materials, as well as their distribution, who's responsible for teacher pre-service training and teacher in-service training, education finance and budgeting and monitoring and evaluation. It's obviously a lot to map, but it's very essential to understanding who needs to be involved in the planning, implementation, and who needs also to be involved in different areas of capacity development. Organizational capacity assessments can be a very useful way of gathering this information in a systematic way, so it's not as ad hoc as programs are implemented. They tend to find out many of these issues, but to have that information up front so that activities can be planned with this in mind of who needs to be involved, how much time needs to be allocated, and what types of capacity development assistance need to be provided. And USAID has a number of resources on their website around organizational capacity assessments as well. Developing the approach to activities and achieving what you want to achieve. One of the aspects of the review of USAID programs was that it found that not a lot of programs had a real succinct or even articulated theory of change. So, for example, rather than assuming that teachers will just be better, will have better instruction if they're provided with training and materials, specifying what exactly will be needed, what are the design and content elements of the teacher's guide that would make it user-friendly as well as effective, what specific development approaches are going to lead to those changes that you want to see. Really articulating those causal pathways will help to inform the design of the program rather than sort of assumptions that people might have that are not necessarily ground truthed or fleshed out with all of the people who are involved in planning. As we've emphasized throughout the webinar series, it's important that approaches and activities be based on evidence and best practices, and then of course contextualized. So if you haven't already checked out the webinars that took place earlier in this month, they're a great summary of the research around the different topical or areas or components of early grade reading programs, so skills and instruction, teacher professional development and coaching. We've tried to distill the real essential and current aspects of evidence that we know so far and how early grade reading programs have used those best practices or the evidence to inform their programming. And we think they can be useful, again, for learning across contexts and across programs. Lastly, but certainly not least, integrating cross-cutting issues during the design phase. Again, not siloing cross-cutting issues like how we're going to make sure our programs result in learning for all children, So thinking about, will the instructional approach and the teaching and learning materials be accessible to children from different backgrounds, from different ethnic or language groups, of children with different abilities. As you may have seen if you read the USAID policy, reaching all children is very much a focus. And REACH recently released this new toolkit called the Universal Design for Learning to Help All Children Read as a way of providing more guidance on promoting literacy for learners with disabilities in particular. If you haven't consulted that resource, it is a very rich body of information, and there's also a helpful webinar by the lead author that gives a nice overview of the guide. So thinking about working with stakeholders and designing programs and the approaches and activities, we've really found through the past few years of experience that agreement on some critical issues is needed to inform the approach, activities, budget, and really the success of the program. And while this list could be even longer, one of the key ones, of course, is the language to be used for reading instruction. So we have to have evidence on what languages are spoken in the targeted areas, what classrooms are multilingual, and then make decisions about what languages should be used. And this might change in terms of the numbers as programs are scaled up, but agreement on this is essential at the very beginning. The instructional approach and content, again, we've noted that evidence has to be consideration for the approach and the activities, and making sure that everybody understands that. So later on, as you're developing your materials, people aren't wondering why you are using a particular instructional strategy, why you're not teaching certain skills, or why you are teaching certain skills. Real agreement and consensus on this is needed. And it often helps to lay out a design document that really justifies your approaches to instruction or materials development that everyone can essentially sign on to. So later, as new people are brought in, or people may be wondering what is happening, they can have a document to refer to say, these were our design considerations, here's why we made the decisions that we did. The objectives, targets, and indicators of the program. Sometimes halfway through a program, of course, you find people who thought maybe the program was supposed to achieve something a little bit different than was intended. And so agreement on objectives and targets, and also indicators. How are you going to measure your progress? What interim steps might you take to show progress or evaluate different aspects of the program? In the comments, some of you talked about needing to have information on different things. So setting out some indicators for how you're going to measure that at the beginning can be a useful way to get some consensus. Copyright and licensing of materials. Could do a show of hands to show of folks who've encountered challenges around copyright and licensing of materials, that this is an issue that everyone working in this early grade reading improvement space is learning a lot about. And REACH had a webinar several months ago that you can check out on our website to learn a bit more about these issues, and a full guidance document is under production now to help clarify for people what is meant by copyright and open licensing of materials specifically, and getting this agreement before you even begin to develop your materials is really essential. What materials you're going to develop and how you're going to go about procurement, of course, goes hand in hand with that. And how resources and results will be shared and with whom. It is really important to map this out and make sure everyone understands what resources will be shared with different groups, with the government, with teachers, with parents, and how you're going to do that, because those different audiences will require different forms of communication. And speaking from the vantage point of the Global Reading Network, we have ourselves found that resources and program results can be difficult to find. And so we really encourage everyone to also share with us or on other platforms like the development, the deck, where all USAID program materials ideally can be found. Developing budgets and thinking about staffing, again, highlighting this because of the nature of sometimes the siloed production of budgets and design plans, that really budgeting, of course, goes hand in hand with the design, that we really need a lot of information to come up with budgets that are realistic and including the geographic location of the program, how many schools we're reaching, the languages, teachers, costs that programs encounter, office space, of course, staff, transportation, materials, educator, professional development. All of these are costs that we know we need to gather, and sometimes our design needs to be adapted to what we find out the different costs are. A couple of words on staffing. Amy mentioned earlier that one of the challenges that USAID itself recognized with the first iteration of the reading work is that there were just not sufficient technical staff in programs to carry out the work. So it's really important to think about staffing personnel having the required skills and knowledge. We know sometimes that's easier said than done. And so time and resources need to be spent on providing professional development opportunities for staff if they don't have this. And there are some examples from different programs of forming mentoring relationships with more experienced experts supporting other staff to gain those skills and knowledge. And just also, of course, making sure that the number of personnel is sufficient to carry out the proposed work. I have heard from a number of programs that this is really particularly important around teacher training and coaching support, that programs often put a lot of the emphasis, and of course they need to, on materials development, and there's many people working on the production of materials, but then when programs move on to training teachers and supporting them, the staff to support those elements of the program and really do the monitoring of them that is needed, there's fewer people to do that. And we know budgets are constrained, but thinking about how we can help to support that will also address, I think, some of the issues that the USAID interim report highlighted as well, about needing to understand what is taking place in the classrooms and how teachers are or are not able to implement the professional development that they are participating in. Finally, developing monitoring, evaluation, and research plan. Once again, not siloing this aspect of program design, but planning it at the same time as the program is designed, including both technical experts and monitoring and evaluation personnel, as well as the program managers and those who have their boots on the ground on a daily basis to understand what's feasible and what modes of data collection are needed. Designing activities in such a way that we can isolate their impact. As Amy mentioned, one of the challenges right now is that we don't exactly know what approaches to teacher professional development and coaching are leading to improved teacher instruction and eventually student outcomes. So we haven't necessarily isolated those different types of interventions for teacher professional development in our programs. So as we move into second generation programs, how can we embed proofs of concept or different forms of teacher professional development to really understand what's working the best? And embedding research into program plans. There's a tremendous need for longitudinal studies of children's skill level over time and across languages, especially in multilingual context. What can we be doing as program implementers to make sure we're gathering that data? Also understanding how teachers change over time. We know, of course, that teachers don't necessarily change after attending one workshop, but what is their trajectory for behavior change? When does coaching become impactful for teachers? So really now moving to the more refined research and understanding of what's happening with our sort of theories of change of when do we see the change in teachers. And also qualitative research. One of the participants mentioned that it's really useful or it's really needed to find out what's happening in the classrooms. And there was a recent study in Malawi that's mentioned in one of the other webinars that was a qualitative study of what teachers were doing in the classrooms and how they were implementing the guided lesson plans, and that what weren't they doing, where were they deviating, and why were they deviating from the lesson plan, and that information was used to inform a second iteration of materials. And that's really quite small scale research, but very impactful. So thinking again, kind of outside the box of maybe the standard monitoring and evaluation to getting that more deeper knowledge of what's happening in our programs. I also wanted to highlight a few things in the blue box there. Amy already mentioned tracking fidelity of implementation, something that more and more programs are trying to do. Often coaches, though, are tasked with doing that, gathering the fidelity of implementation data and thinking about how we could also be doing that perhaps in other ways to better understand when things are working or when they aren't working, what was the level of fidelity of implementation to different aspects of the program. Developing metrics for government capacity and sustainability. As Amy also mentioned, that was a big gap that USAID noted, is that programs don't necessarily measure this or assess it to see how it's changing over time. But this is a really key question as programs scale up and aim to be sustainable. And lastly, the cost effectiveness of activities. It's not sufficient alone, as we know, to know how much it costs and whether it was effective. We need to understand what was the effectiveness based on the cost to make decisions about different approaches. So thinking about some of these steps, what steps do you feel need more attention to inform ongoing implementation of your program and potential redesign as you are perhaps scaling up or going into a new phase of your program?
Allison, this is Amy. I would particularly be interested in hearing from anybody who has conducted an education system mapping and who has really looked at the capacity of the current system and where some gaps might be and how their program is working to address that. I think this is really one of the critical issues of planning for sustainability in the long run. So anyone who's got anything to share about systems mapping and capacity assessment in terms of the overall system, that would be great to hear about.
See, Emily has shared one, that her experiences with 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are normally assumed, but step 2, which is to conduct the literacy landscape assessment and background research, and 3, the education system mapping, are critical, but they don't always happen or have the appropriate funding and time available. And I would agree 100% with that, and many of the folks in the community have as well, which is one reason that the literacy landscape assessment is being developed and supported by USAID as a way to more systematically do that even prior to programs being awarded. Jean says, regarding system mapping, one issue is that there isn't always the transparency one might hope for doing this. What education departments say are the procedures and routines don't match up with teachers' experiences. And Jean, certainly that is important to ground truth, maybe what people or institutions' roles and responsibilities are on paper or what they say they are with what they are in actuality, because certainly their capacity may also be impacting whether or not they're able to carry those out. And so there's a lot of uncovering of rocks to figure out what is really the reality on the ground, and talking to very local education authorities at district levels and teachers themselves will provide a really great broader picture in that regard. Brenda also noted that determining cost effectiveness has been a challenge, and would love to hear more about how others are addressing this. So if people would like to share any experiences with Brenda, and Brenda will also try to follow up with you and share some in the resources that everyone will be getting at the end. So thinking about now how we plan for successful scale-up and sustainability along the way as we're designing programs and implementing them.
So first of all, let's kind of parse apart scale-up and sustainability, because we tend to talk about them like they're the same thing, and they're not. So when we talk about scale-up, what we're really talking about is how an innovation or a program gets expanded. It either grows in terms of its size, or it grows in terms of the numbers of children and teachers that it impacts. Sustainability is a very different issue. And when we're talking about early grades reading programs, what we're really usually talking about is either components of a program or a full program being really integrated into a national education system. And to do that in a way where there is no more external financing required. So that's about really handing a program over to the local leadership group at the national level, regional level, district level, in a way that the knowledge base and the skills are housed at the national level, not externally, and that project can be sustained over time. But in addition, that it is fully integrated with government priorities. It's fully integrated with government materials provision and training provision and all of the kind of operational things that make systems function, so that there doesn't need to be additional funding or replacement funding for things that are still existing outside the government system. And it's important to note that you can scale up a program. You can move it from a small pilot to a multi-region program. You can even take it national, but it is not necessarily sustainable. That sustainability issue is that ability for external funding and external expertise to be able to walk away and know that everything is in place for that program to continue successfully over time. So when we look at the characteristics of effective scale up, we're really linking back to where we started in this section, this idea of leadership, collaboration, adaptation, building capacity, getting to the cost effectiveness of a program, and then being able to gather the data and track and monitor performance over time. So when you have the leadership existing in country and you've got champions at every level who are supporting the program and who own the program, they really add legitimacy to the program for people who are implementing at the local level. They also add authority to that program as well, which goes to the issue of accountability. Full integration into national programs is critical in order to have true accountability for implementation at the local level. The collaboration issues, just to kind of reiterate what we talked about earlier, this is about making sure stakeholders and stakeholder groups that should be working together and that you may assume are working together, that they actually have a structure and a process to coordinate with one another, make work more efficient. Left hand is talking to the right hand. Policy decisions are in line with what's being done in pre-service, what's being done in in-service. So making sure the system functions around a common set of understandings and has continuous collaboration and discussion about what's critical to do. So you will probably remember that earlier we talked about this issue of fidelity and flexibility. And so when we start to look at scale up, we need to begin to look at this question of what are the core characteristics of the program that we started with, that we know are critical, that we know work, and how do we incorporate the kinds of modifications that are needed in order to get it to be successful at scale. Because some of the approaches we might use in a small pilot or in a limited regional program cannot be successful at scale. And so this goes back again to the issue of thinking about scale up as we begin to design and plan our programs. So if we have an approach or we have a strategy and we have an internal discussion that says, well, this will work at the pilot level, but it creates issues at a multi-region level, we are already endangering the capacity of the program to move into scale up over time. So again, the need for kind of back mapping of a program, getting a vision of full scale up, and planning backwards based on that. How do we make sure everything is going the direction that it needs to go? Then also data and performance tracking. So when you have effective scale up, you're really looking at a system that's in place that everyone knows how to use to continue to track student performance and gather data so that that kind of scale up process can be well informed. And you can make adaptations over time as needed as you see whether your projected approaches for how scale up would work are actually functioning that way and ways to make some adaptations. So some examples of scale-up efforts. We know we can look at 10 countries in terms of looking at efforts to really scale up, and those countries are listed here on the screen. And overall, in looking at what happened across those programs, you can really lay out some characteristics that actually create a potential for scale-up, and then those challenges that really get in the way of scale-up as well. So programs that successfully scaled up are very context specific, which means they're either designed for the particular context or they're well adapted into that particular context. Also, high levels of collaboration between external funders, between those who are implementing at all levels, and between the and with the government. So real strong partnerships and real strong collaboration throughout the process of moving from initiation into a scale-up phase. You can see on the right hand the kinds of challenges that exist. When government capacity in terms of knowledge, skills, operations, and structures is not there to be able to carry out the implementation at scale, those scale-up efforts are much less successful. Also, enabling conditions. So are the conditions in place so that the program components actually have the opportunity to really be institutionalized, become habits of work and habits of behavior across the different levels of the educational sector? So you can see here, there's some things that you can plan to do early on and work on consistently throughout your program work that really will provide you with a better opportunity for scale up in the long run. And so we also know that we can provide you a resource. So there's a resource listed here around scale up of early grade reading programs, and it gives you a good, fairly comprehensive overview of how to think about scale up, and then also some of these examples from the different countries that we're looking at.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks some of you for having shared some experiences with us about this. Candace had noted that even when a program is fully aligned with what the government is doing and built into government structures and budgets, changes to the government can mean that priorities change, and certainly that's an issue. One would hope that if your curriculum is the approved curriculum, though, and maybe teacher professional development approaches are the approved approaches, that some of what you're doing would hopefully stay the same. But it's certainly an issue that programs have seen is changes in leadership can result in things not always continuing on as you would have hoped. In the last 30 minutes of our webinar, we're going to share with you some tools that we've developed or adapted from existing ones to think about the key considerations for scale-up and sustainability, those enabling conditions that Amy mentioned. What do we need to facilitate success beyond the life of a project? If you look at handout 2, and I apologize, there's a typo here, this should say handout 2. We've taken a look at the previously mentioned resource on early grade reading program scale up that examined the characteristics of effective scale up efforts in 10 countries and tried to synthesize these into essentially a worksheet that could potentially be beneficial to program teams as you think about the things that you have considered or potentially not considered around scale up and sustainability. So you can take a minute to bring that up, and we'll be looking at that right now. So this framework takes into consideration the fact that early grade reading improvement efforts are usually funded by external donors with the aim of being scaled up nationally and integrated within a country's overall education system. So we've, again, following the analysis that was done of the 10 countries that have scaled up their programs, the framework reflects 3 key aspects of early grade reading programs: the core elements of the program, or the core components. We can think of these as ingredients. So what is the content and instructional approach? What is the teacher professional development plan and activities? What teaching and learning resources are being provided? What are the enabling policies and standards that need to be in place? And how is equity and inclusivity integrated throughout? So these also map onto the Mosaic components that Amy shared earlier, which USAID is really looking at as a comprehensive plan for effective early grade reading programming. So going through that, thinking about, were the appropriate skills and evidence-based approaches used? And if not, how might this need to be adapted? I know some programs are, after an initial version of materials development, they're revising them, thinking about how instruction needs to still be adapted for a particular language, even making changes to instructional approaches given orthographies or writing systems, and how those may require different approaches to different languages, even within the same country. The second column there is design and planning. So this refers to essentially the roadmap that programs would follow to be successful, ideally, and kind of a question checklist of things that we would want to see in programs. For example, first and foremost is the approach based on evidence. Are activities aligned? One of the common constraints of programs to date has been that pre-service teacher training is often not aligned with what teachers are expected to do in their classrooms, or the in-service teacher training, and the need for early grade reading programs to be better aligned across aspects of teacher professional development, as well as, of course, teacher remuneration needs to be aligned with that, and student assessment, everything across the whole system. We'll be going through this list in just a minute, but the third column is the enabling environment, or some of the conditions for success, and we'll take you through those also in. So if you want to look through this handout, specifically the first column that we talked about, core components, looking through that list, has your program incorporated all of the key ingredients? What's working well, and in particular, what gaps remain that you need to address during the course of implementation or in a second generation of your program? And then the second column as well, the design and planning considerations. Has your program adequately incorporated these into its roadmap for success? What's working well, and where do you still see gaps remaining? As you go through the two columns here, I know three that we would be particularly interested in hearing from you is about whether the design and planning is achievable within the intended time frame. Are we trying to do too much too quickly? What are you finding are successes that can be achieved relatively quickly in a couple of years within programs? And the feasibility of what we're doing as well, especially for teachers and education authorities. How quickly can we see take up of these new ways of teaching and learning?
And Allison, we've got a good point from Claire as well. So when we're really looking here at scale up, and also I think even more so sustainability, is the new USAID policy really focuses a lot on capacity building inside the country and this issue of commitment to the change. And it goes back to what Candace is talking about, how it's tough to keep things moving when government priorities are changing all the time, and in some cases government is changing all the time. So I think those two pieces linked together, we can see really clearly from policy, from the USAID policy, that they recognize the need to be able to start from the beginning with the capacity building in order to successfully leave behind good quality programs that stand a chance of continuing.
Let me just mention one more comment from Bram in South Africa, who's noted that they focused the first round of their reading improvement program on 3 ingredients, specifically these lesson plans, quality reading materials, and training for coaches. So a very targeted approach, now exploring issues of scaling up. Bram, I think, brings up a really important issue of scaffolding and staggering what is done in early grade reading programs. We talk about all of these ingredients and the need to do so many things to make programs successful, but it can be helpful to focus on these core issues and then expand from there and add on as we understand what's working with these different ingredients. So thank you, Bram, for mentioning that.
And Allison, can I add a bit related to that? There's a new document coming out from USAID in the coming couple of months that talks about early grades literacy and math programs linked to the new policy with a focus on numeracy. And it's a guidance document to help missions and donors and implementers consider where do you put your resources and where do you put your efforts initially. It goes to Bram's comment about how you can't really focus in a deep way on all of the components, but you need to take a look at that literacy landscape, and you need to do that background research to know what's most needed and where also are the leverage points where the ground is best prepared to be able to move quickly and make changes that can then influence changes in other component areas.
Yes, and I just wanted to tack on as well to Bram's comment about focusing on these essential ingredients. Of course, there's still, each one of them is quite big, but out of that work, I'm aware of a study that was done where they shared a lot of information about their coaching program, and you can find resources and a reference to that very detailed study in the webinar on coaching, and we thank the folks in South Africa for sharing their experience there. Okay, Amy is going to continue on with thinking through some of these issues related to enabling conditions for scale-up and sustainability.
Thanks, Allison. We put together a handout 3, a third handout on the things you need to consider and the conditions that need to be in place for scale-up to happen successfully, and in the end for sustainability to exist in country for program approaches. And we're going to go through them one by one. So we really want you to think about it at 3 levels. And we're actually going to do a couple of polls here. We're going to use the polling structure, and you will see in a few minutes a poll come up for you to respond to. But there are some critical areas that need to be looked at in terms of what you need to consider and the conditions that you need to help support for scale up and sustainability to be possible. And so the first one is really that there needs to be in country and among the stakeholders a real demand for improvement. People need to have a commitment to this. There need to be these change agents in place and leadership developed in country for the banner to be carried forward by those for whom the improvement is intended, and the community for whom the improvement is intended. And so one of the things that has to happen is that we really have to begin to look very early on about bringing together groups of stakeholders, getting them actively engaged, not just in educating, but in leadership positions, decision-making and collaboration, sharing with them the evidence that's available about what works best, why it's important, what currently exists in country, because we will sometimes be surprised at the little bit of information that's known by core and key stakeholders about what's actually happening in instruction in country, and then helping work with them in collaboration to identify pathways for change. And so one of the things we want you to think about now is your own program experience. So in looking at this issue of building a demand for improvement among the leadership in different stakeholder groups in country, is this something your program has deeply considered and integrated into your design? Is it something you kind of considered and minimally integrated, or do you think this is a big gap in your program? And Stephanie is going to be posting a poll for you to respond to on this first consideration of making sure the demand for improvement is embedded in the education community in country. We have about close to a 50-50 split that people have deeply considered this in their initial design, meaning actively engaged with critical stakeholders from the beginning of program design and implementation. And then in some cases, minimally integrated or minimally considered. And I think I might be guessing that in my own experience, one of the things that I have found is when we have not really considered it too much, it immediately becomes apparent upon implementation. And that's one of those issues of beginning to adapt very early on to make sure the key stakeholders are always involved. And it's great to see that very few of the programs being reflected on and shared today have failed to include this in their design. So our second key consideration is planning with scale up in mind. And we've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to be talking about it very much. But the idea that from the very beginning, when we make decisions about our own program implementation, no matter how large or small it is, that we have that vision of scale up in mind, a SWOT analysis to inform scale up and sustainability, trying out different approaches, making sure we're flexible because the conditions surrounding the program can change over time, as we've noted from a lot of comments in the chat today. But also being aware, how do you get to scale up without watering down the kinds of key components, for example, that were shared today by Brahm, those things that are critical. So we're going to post another poll. So the question really is, to what extent has your program done its design planning with scale up in mind? It's fairly consistent with the results for this idea of building commitment and demand for improvement, and a little higher on the end of deeply considering scale up. Only a smaller amount minimally considering, and very few where this is a gap in the program. And usually, I mean, this issue of scale up, we're required in terms of our designs to consider scale up and to consider how to get to that level of scale up. One of the things that I think is important for us to keep considering, even though we plan with scale up in mind, we may be planning with scale up timelines, we may be planning with scale up numbers in terms of outreach. I think one of the things that I've seen in my own program work that could be less strong is this idea of planning approaches or specific component design elements with scale up in mind. So for example, if we're working in a pilot program where we do outreach to coaches and we provide additional funding to support coaches in going out to schools, or we increase the time that coaches are available to schools with additional external funding, while we are planning for scale up by knowing that coaching is going to be critical and that capacity to locally support is going to be critical, if we do that in a context where there is not the capacity in the long run to maintain that level of focus on coaching and that level of commitment, then we've got some sticky issues in terms of scale up. So I can encourage all of you to continue looking at very specific program components to ask and answer the question, is this particular approach sustainable and scalable without continued external funding and support? Moving on to the next key consideration is this issue of cost and cost effectiveness. And some of the questions that you really need to ask yourself in terms of analyzing cost and cost effectiveness. You need to know which of your program components will be a recurring cost at a scaled up level, and even beyond scale up when you release that program at the national level, and which kinds of things will not be a recurring cost. Is there funding and finance available at a scaled up level for those recurring cost pieces to be continued or not? And how might costs change over time? There are some cases where we build in program components where the cost of the provision of those components goes down over time. There's also those components where the cost can go up over time. And so those are all things to consider around cost and cost effectiveness. The fourth key consideration is this issue of resource allocation and distribution of resources. We struggle a lot in programs to get resources into the hands of teachers in a timely manner, particularly under tight timelines. And so we have to think about and consider the provision of resources at a massive scale. This goes back to costs. This goes back to recurring costs, costs increasing and costs going down as well. We've got to know a lot about the education sector budgeting and expenditures that exist. How might those be allocated with that stakeholder commitment and ownership into the right areas? But what are some of the gaps in budgeting and the gaps in expenditures that could affect the scalability of a program as well? Our fifth key consideration is to assess and strengthen the capacity of the education system. And we saw from earlier conversations that this issue of assessing the capacity of the system to take the large-scale program in hand over time, we had brief discussions on the chat about how this is generally something that could be considered a weakness. So when we talk about assessing and strengthening the capacity of the system, we're talking about the ability of the early grades program to operate within the broader education system as it exists, and the need to monitor and assess the capacity development that happens over time. This goes to the metrics discussion, an organizational capacity assessment, making sure you know what is the ability of the system to take this program long-term and where are the gaps in capacity that need to be filled in and supported and built out as your program is moving from small scale to larger scale. So we're going to do a small poll on this one. To what extent has your program work really focus deeply on assessing and strengthening the capacity of the education system. Assessing the education system capacity and building the education system capacity, we can see a really high rate of deeply considered and integrated in terms of the work that all of our participants are doing. This, for me, is linked to this earlier issue that we talked about in terms of building leadership at the national level to take over and sustain programs over time. And more we're seeing early grades reading programs that may initially begin from an external point of view, and even when they're small, pilot or even multi-region inside a country, we're seeing a lot more integration of programs early on within the education system, and a lot more sharing of knowledge and information, and things as common as Ministry of Education staff being seconded to programs in order to gain knowledge and skills, and bringing that knowledge and skills back to the national level, as well as a lot of reading programs that are being adapted and adopted into national programs as the national model. Great. So our sixth key consideration is an issue of disruptions to the status quo. So when you begin to scale up a program, it's more likely that that program is going to kind of put pressure on the things that people are comfortable with as the way that they are. Again, the status quo. People have different vested interests. They have a lot of interest sometimes in having their particular priorities or the priorities of their teams to be well funded and well supported. And sometimes when you begin to scale up programs, you really put pressure on other areas of the system. And so it's really important to understand clearly what are the contextual hot button issues, and where are the places where you're likely to consider pushback as you work with government to attempt to scale up programs. For example, sometimes scaling up programs can mean alterations in job descriptions. An example, in a program that I worked on, there were staff at the district level who were school inspectors, and their job was relatively clean cut. They went into schools, they gathered information from the school principal, they brought it back to the district level, and it ran up the system into their region and national level. And in scaling up and in adopting an external program at the national level, they altered the job description of these school inspectors. Now, for many of them, it was a welcome alteration, but for others it wasn't. So you need to take a look at what are the kinds of changes scaling up programs can create within the system, and where are the places where you're likely to get some pushback. Our seventh consideration is to create and support effective partnerships. And we've talked a lot about collaboration and partnerships in terms of opening pathways for scale up, and also transferring knowledge, skills, and ownership for sustainability. So we not only need to look at those public stakeholders and public stakeholder groups that need to be knowledgeable, need to be partners, need to be leaders and decision makers, but also private stakeholders as well, and the different constituencies inside the country who really need to be partners in the improvement. We also need to make sure from the beginning that government and donor partners, implementers are all working together, talking together, pulling those groups in to make sure that there is that sense of mission and there is a shared sense of vision, so that as the program moves forward and moves towards scale up and sustainability, that leadership at the national level and internally inside country is a natural extension of the program. We're going to do a little poll. You know what? I'm going to ask Stephanie that we do not poll on that. I'm watching our time. Our last two key considerations. Key consideration 8, policies, regulations, and protocols need to support early grades reading. I've talked a little bit about this already, making sure that there are structures in place within the system, whether that's policies that continue to support the commitment to the program, regulations in terms of staff roles and operations at both the local level, district, regional, and national level, and protocols for bringing teachers into the system. For example, teacher recruitment, teacher qualifications, continuing education for teachers, what's the content of the curriculum, how do you develop, procure, and provide books for early grades reading programs, how do you support and also supervise teachers at the local school level, and then we've talked earlier about how to monitor learning outcomes. Our last key consideration, and this was mentioned, I believe, earlier by Emily, is this issue of incentives and accountability measures. The idea that you have to be able to develop with that full stakeholder leadership group potential incentives to keep the program moving forward, to keep people commitment, to keep teachers in place who have the knowledge and skills to know how to help children learn to read, but then also accountability mechanisms. And I know in my own experience in multiple countries, these accountability mechanisms are not as strong as they could be. And so while some may look at accountability mechanisms as being a negative thing, actually those accountability mechanisms also allow programs and allow ministries to identify areas where great practice is going on, where great growth is going on, and we need that information as much as we need information about those who are in need in order to know what's working and how to spread that out across the system. And so this is just a nice summary of really everything we've talked about for the last couple of hours. We need to focus on the evidence of what works, bring together the critical stakeholders in collaboration, get everything in context for our target population, make sure things are aligned and integrated, make sure monitoring and evaluation and design go hand in hand, so we're gathering the kind of data we need to really inform ourselves and our partners about what works and what's critical in terms of design. Looking at timeline, staffing, and resources that are available and that need to be available, and then this focus on scalability and sustainability.
Thank you very much, Amy. And thanks everyone for joining us for the past 2 hours. We know this is a topic in particular that we found a little bit more difficult to adapt for the online seminars, but we hope that you learned something or heard about others' experiences. All of the materials will be available on the website very shortly after this event, and you're welcome also to reach out to myself or to Amy directly. Also the Global Reading Network, if you have resources to share, if something that you've produced you think would be a great example for us to include, we will be happy to receive that from you. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see you at another Global Reading Network event in the future.